I was interviewed on YouTube a year into the struggle that was happening in my country by a YouTube channel, Morris. It's 108 Morris 108, and I'd already been involved politically for years before that, but anonymously. And basically, I had to get over the fear of becoming a public figure and showing my face to the world and all of that entails. I didn't think that it would be that I would get any views or that people would watch. I didn't see where it was going to go. It just sort of happened. But I was afraid at the time of course, being threatened by crazy people online, the usual thing. So that's how I became Syrian Girl, was that one day I got called for an interview by Alex Jones, and Morris suggested I open up my own channel, and I've been speaking politically on that ever since. It's Syrian Girl Partisan, and I have a Twitter account which is Partisan Girl.
Great. Well, it's hard to talk about what's happening to the children in Syria right now, but who do you think is behind the gas?
Well, I think since a year ago, the people who even brought up chemical weapons before any incident occurred, before anyone suggested that they might be used, or the conflict would even reach this point, was the US government and Obama, and then again Israel at the United Nations. And there was no indication before that, and I think the agenda was clear to make serious chemical weapons an issue, because the game plan is always to try to disarm nations from their weapons of mass destruction, and which are a deterrent against aggression, because of what they can do. They are city destroyers. So of course an invading army would be afraid of that. So that's been the trend for Iraq. There was disarmament before invasion, and for Libya as well. And of course Afghanistan, Somalia, they never had WMDs to begin with, so they were an easy target. So going back to Syria and who I believe did this, I think that I'm not going to put the blame on any specific group inside Syria, because it doesn't exactly matter if it was Al-Qaeda, if it was the FSA, if it was like corrupt people. It could have been spies, for all we know, that could have come in from anywhere. And as you know, the borders are wide open. But I think that the agenda behind bringing up chemical weapons and trying to push it in the UN is clear, and it's clear who benefits from it, and that is the global elite who have taken over the US government and have basically brought many nations to their knees, and many nations to work against their own people's interests and follow the global elite's interests.
I know that no one particular group has really come forward on this. What do you think about Iran? It's really quiet over there.
Iran, what I believe of most of the nations that we see is that the nation states, if they're not controlled, if they're independent, they're going to act in what is their interests. And that's not always the right thing. And sometimes it is the right thing by them, and it's within their right. So on Iran, I would say I support Iran in its struggle against imperialism, or in its struggle against being taken over or suppressed. And Syria and Iran are allies, of course. But I'm not going to say that all of Iran's actions across the Middle East have been helpful against imperialism. For example, in Iraq, Iran actually worked with the Americans in invasion inside Iraq in order to suppress any resistance movement and to create sectarianism. And you could say that it's worked in Iran's favor in some ways, but I think in the big picture, it works against everybody's favor. But again, Syria and Iran are allies. They have a mutual defense pact, and the assaults against Iran's sovereignty is something that anybody who believes in people's right to sovereignty to independence should be opposed to.
Well, and so with that being said, Egypt is it's all over the place. There's so many things happening there. Where do you start to break it down, and how does Syria fit into the equation with what's happening in Egypt right now?
Well, for decades, a lot of the Middle East have been living under dictatorships or monarchies. And some of those dictatorships and monarchies were the greatest allies of the US. And some of them were the worst enemies. And some of them were allies and then enemies. So to say that the US wants democracy in the Middle East is very naive. And in 2011, we saw these Arab Springs happening, as they call them, all these revolutions happening all over the Middle East, only they replaced a lot of the secular governments with theocratic Islam-based governments. Now, as a I don't think that it's in any country's interest to divide their nation by making the figurehead just one religion, any religion. It's not specific to one religion. So the reason for that was twofold. You could say that Qatar and Saudi Arabia were funding a lot of these revolutions and were making them happen because they wanted to sponsor, especially Qatar and Turkey wanted to sponsor the Muslim Brotherhood, which is one of the political movements that have never really taken power in the Middle East up until now, 2011, but have always attempted to do so since 40 years or more. So in Egypt, you had the Muslim Brotherhood in power under Morsi, and his government was extremely unpopular.
And why was that? Why was it unpopular? And why do you think it's taken so long for the Muslim Brotherhood to get into power?
Well, it's an unpopular movement. I mean, it's people look at it under suspicion. They see it as the worst of two evils. I'm not saying they don't have support. They do have support, but they don't have support of the majority, at least not in Egypt. And it's clear by what happened in the second time, the second spring. Maybe they'll call it that, but actually they're calling it a military coup. But I want to say that...
well, over there maybe, but not here apparently. Obama doesn't want to call it a coup.
Well, with the return of the military government, like Egypt was, before the Muslim Brotherhood, was under the Mubarak regime, which was despotic and which, was pretty much one of the pawns of the New World Orders. They had a massive amount of IMF debt. Their people were not under great living conditions. So now to see the Muslim Brotherhood being pulled down and this old government returned, which of course had its ties to the US and Israel, I don't think I don't think we should be too excited or too happy like it's the greatest thing that ever happened. I think it's clear that it shows that secularism is still alive in the Middle East. But it also shows that maybe democracy isn't, and I say that with a lot of skepticism because I don't believe democracy is alive anywhere, nor was it under Morsi. But there's not really a change now in Egypt. There's just a return of the old way.
In your opinion, what would be the first step to peace in the Middle East?
I think the first step to peace in the Middle East would be to end intervention from the outside to try to take control of those countries, that and occupation inside the Middle East. And when I say occupation, I don't just mean that the US has invaded and has troops in a country. That should go too. That's fueling all of the problems and instigating infighting between people. But I also mean the occupation of Palestine, because since the fall of the Ottoman Empire and World War II, when the the Balfour Declaration was signed and Israel was formed, which was 30% of the Jewish population in Palestine, taking 70% of the land. That was really the start and the seed of sectarianism. Because before that, for hundreds of years, Jews and Christians and Muslims were living in Palestine, or you could call it, ancient Israel, whatever the name. But they were living in that land peacefully together. And it was it was the land of them all. But the Zionist ideology came in and said, no, this land only belongs to the Jews. And anybody who isn't Jewish, get out. And that's why you've ended up with a piece of land called Israel now that used to have a majority of Palestinians and now has a majority of Europeans that immigrated into the land and pushed the people that lived there out. And that injustice is ongoing. It's not something that happened 50 years ago.
Yeah,
There's
no.
still 3 million refugees living scattered all over the world. They're Palestinian, but the Zionist ideology is still there. So in order to preserve the idea that the land can only be Jewish, those people that still hold the key to their homes are not allowed to go back to their homes. They're not allowed, the refugees are not allowed to return to the land that is now Israel. And that seed of injustice has created an ongoing conflict. And from that source that wants to keep hold of this land's ideology, we see lots of infighting. And I would say that the end of Zionism might not be the complete cure, because of course there's always going to be agendas to try to control each other. There's always been wars, but that would definitely be a step forward for the Middle East, for people to decide that they can share the land. I believe in a one-state solution where Palestinians and Israelis, Jews, Muslims, Christians live in one state, an equal state where people are equal citizens. And it's not known as a Jewish state or a Muslim state. It's known as the people's state. If we can achieve that is the dream. And for world peace or total peace in the future, in the long run, the only thing I can think is that people need to grow up internally. I can't think of any other way right now. I'm afraid, I have no solutions. There's always going to be somebody that wants to steal somebody else's meal. So that's until